Good morning. We're delighted to have you joining us. We have a wonderful panel ahead of us. We encourage you to please go ahead and sit down and we'll begin. I'm so delighted today to be able to be the moderator and join you all for this fascinating discussion. We have wonderful panelists we're very excited to have here. At the outset, I thought it might be appropriate, given the mass shooting not too far from here, if you wouldn't mind joining me in a moment of silence for those who were the victims of the tragedy. Thank you. I think events like this remind us that whatever the cause of violence, tragedy is the result. I'm grateful that we have a panel that can bring a great deal of experience to bear on these kinds of discussions, in our case, on religion and religious freedom and security. We'll be looking at the relation between religion and security from both a preventative point of view, how religions can be active, and also some of the tensions that come with religious expressions and security concerns that Judge Shayo mentioned last night, both because of the difficulties that he identified of it, that security is both a legitimate concern of nations, that public order is in international law an acceptable basis for limiting religious freedom, but also that it can be overbroad and overused. In international law, there's also a limit. One can't derogate from the right to religious freedom for national security concerns. That regardless of how challenging this is, that religious freedom is a core belief and must be implemented, even if at times it has to be limited. Anyway, I'm looking forward to hearing from them. I'll stop there, but let me give a brief introduction. There are longer bios in the back. I'd encourage you to read those. I won't take too much time from each of them to say that there's a lot that could be said. Our first speaker will be Dr. Azza Karam. She serves as the Senior Advisor on Culture at the United Nations Population Fund. She coordinates the fund's outreach with faith-based partners, and particularly significantly for our discussion today, she chairs the UN Interagency Task Force on Faith-Based Organization Partners. She has wide experience in this field. She's also worked as a special advisor on the Middle East and Islamic affairs and director of women's programs at the World Conference for Religions at Peace. She has a great deal of experience to bear, and we're grateful for her. I should go on, but I need to give time to each of our presenters. And then following her, we'll hear from Andrew Bennett, who is a senior fellow and chair of the Cabinet of Canadians at Cardis Law, and he's former ambassador of religious freedom. He was the first to hold that post in Canada and did a remarkable job internationally, but efforts to promote the important value of freedom of religion or belief. He also has a PhD in history from the University of Edinburgh and degrees in history from Dalhousie and McGill in Canada. He's a scholar and someone who's been passionate in this field, and we're grateful for his use of his knowledge and passion to make a difference. Then we will hear from Merete Bilde, from the European Union. She's a policy advisor at the European External Action Service, working on foreign affairs for the EU. Before that, she's worked in the office of the policy unit for the EU High Representative, Javier Solana, on issues related to political aspects of Islam and cross-cultural relations. She really is the heart of so much of what's happening at the EU on religion issues. Taking these and building in the infrastructure internally to be able to make a significant difference externally, which she does, and we are grateful for her. Our final speaker will be Dr. Hajji, from Belgium. There we go. Apologies. He is the Secretary General of the European Council of the Moroccan Ulema and President of the Brussels Forum on Wisdom and World Peace. He's been heavily involved in training imams throughout Europe and meeting and working on interfaith efforts with religious leaders. He has a crucial role there to play in the many difficult issues that Muslims face in Europe at this time. He has a PhD in Anglo-American Studies from Paris Sorbonne and has had research on issues of renewal of Islamic discourse, Muslims in Europe, geopolitics, and geopoetics, as a published author as well. I could say far more about each of them, but we are grateful for the time that they have to share with us. We'll proceed with all of them, and then we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
How do you?
Just use this clicker, and usually you'll see slides here as well.
Super, great, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Salam Alaikum, peace be upon you all. It is a great privilege and honor to be with you here today, and I want to extend a special, deep, sincere gratitude and thank you to the BYU, and particularly to two people who I know were the reason I'm here, Julie and Dave Colton. And the reason for gratitude, I hope I don't embarrass them too much, but the reason for gratitude has to do with the fact not only that they proposed my name forward, but also, frankly, because when you work as I do with many religious communities in the United Nations system, and you work as I do with many religious communities in the United Nations system as a Muslim woman, very often it's very hard to belong to any one particular community, because each community looks upon me with a wee bit of suspicion, including my own, which kind of wonders why I seem to like all the other religions equally much and open the space to everybody equally much. So it is rare to have an opportunity to feel welcomed by one particular faith community. And I have to say that thanks to Julie and Dave and Ryan Coe, I have felt particularly welcomed by this community, for which I'm deeply grateful and shall always be. So, as you heard, by the way, you can count from now. That was just a preamble. As you heard, I chair a United Nations interagency task force on religion. And what this really means is that way beyond the mandate of my own organization, which is the United Nations Population Fund, I work with approximately 20 different UN system entities. They include the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, UNDP, diverse entities within the UN system. And I will tell you a little bit about the experience. My job here is really to share with you a little bit of why we have decided to work with religious communities and how we see this work, what have we learned from the experiences, and just to share a few headlights that are emerging in terms of warning signs based on what we've learned and what we feel we have achieved working together within the UN system, but also working with our faith partners. I should begin by letting you know that we see religious freedom, freedom of religion and belief, as a fundamental and intrinsic right, but part of a system of human rights. We do not focus uniquely on FORB, freedom of religion and belief, with a very deliberate intentionality behind that. Remember, I'm talking about the United Nations system. I'm not talking about only one UN entity or only one UN office. I am fully aware of the fact that we often see freedom of religion and belief, and we're often told that freedom of religion and belief is intrinsic to every single other freedom. But I want to share with you another truth, which is that every single freedom we deal with, we're often told that that is intrinsic to every other freedom, that is intimately connected and foundational to every other freedom. That is what we are told because we work with the entire gamut of human rights. In the United Nations system, we are fundamentally 193 governments. That is what the United Nations system is, first and foremost, 193 governments. Now, you all know that it is mighty hard to get one government to see eye to eye on anything. So when we have 193, we have a veritable party where the challenge, the strength becomes the Achilles heel. The strength of 193 governments convened is also the Achilles heel of this institution and this modality. But when people talk about the United Nations, we often forget two things. One, that it is 193 governments trying to come up with common decisions, issues, ideas, and approaches. We also forget that the United Nations system is 65 different entities. Each entity a world unto itself. The World Bank Group is one entity out of 65. So the United Nations system is a complicated coalition of mechanisms, and it is an even more complicated coalition of governments. So now that we're all on the same page about the United Nations system, let me tell you a little bit of what we're engaged with. How do I go forward? This one? Thank you. So I'm going to share very briefly the UN Task Force and why we decided to engage with faith actors, how we engage with faith actors, and because this is a very special group of people, we're also going to test what is an emerging theory of engagement with faith actors. Because believe it or not, even though we are practitioners, many of us are also scholars of international relations, of human development, of sociology, of political science, medical doctors. Many of us are scholars, not just practitioners. And there is an emerging theory that I would like to share with you. And I'm going to end on some of the lessons learned, what's worked, what's been incredible in terms of our ability to work together, but also what's not really working and why. And those are basically some of the challenges. The last two parts, the 7 do's and don'ts, I may not share, simply because we can have that conversation later if you wish. And this is mostly advice, if you will, or wisdom given to our colleagues in the UN system, but also our colleagues in different international agencies and governments who are trying to work on religion. We share with them the 7 do's and don'ts. So, the truth of the matter is that we realize how religions matter, and I'll tell you a little bit about that why, but the United Nations Task Force came together informally in 2007. And it came together in the context of a conversation that took place thanks to a resolution, a General Assembly resolution. Now, a General Assembly resolution means 193 governments agreed. So they're really quite interesting, these GA resolutions. Agreed and implemented are two different things, but they agreed that there needs to be something called a tripartite forum. Thanks to the government of the Philippines and the government of Pakistan coming together, they pushed forward this idea that you needed a tripartite forum. What was the tripartite forum? Tripartite. Governments, UN entities, and civil society. And that this forum should be the space to begin to have a conversation under the auspices of the United Nations around how to engage together to achieve the human rights agenda, very specifically. Those of us who came together with the umbrella of the United Nations system to represent the United Nations system in the tripartite forum ended up realizing that we were sharing a very common agenda, which is the agenda of religious engagement. The government of the Philippines and the government of Pakistan had religion as one of their main issues that they wanted to allow this tripartite forum to explore. Look at how we're dealing with religious issues. And that's why it was a Muslim government, technically, and a largely Catholic-inspired government. And they really wanted to push this agenda forward, but they didn't name it as religion. They said, come together to discuss how human rights is achieved in these different cultural contexts. Quintessentially, those of us who are members of the United Nations system came together and formed the UN Interagency Task Force. The objectives of the task force are very straightforward. We want to use this space to learn from one another. Who is doing what with which religious actors, where, when, and why. And just to have that space, safe space within the UN system to be able to exchange. Remember I told you we're 65 different entities. At that time, 5 of us came together. We eventually grew to become 20. But at that time, the idea was, let's just know what we're each doing. Who are we dealing with? Why are we dealing with these different religious actors? What is this world of religion in the first place? So we began very systematically to start tracking who we were working with, where, when, why, and how. And that wealth of knowledge internally is what propelled the UN Interagency System Task Force to become actually a place where other UN system entities wanted to come, because there was a lot of learning taking place there. But we also have been approached by different UN offices to try to advise. We have this religion issue, how do we get engaged with it? And I'll share some examples of this with you later. So we give policy advice, we build our own internal capacities within the UN system because we realized that yes, religion matters and yes, religion is important, but we don't all know what that actually means and how that actually translates into. And how do you deal with faith-based actors? Because it's not as if you just involve a few friends and bring them around the table, but it's fundamentally, how do you even negotiate a common project with a faith-based organization or faith-based actor? That there are skills and sensitivities and sensibilities that are required that can never be assumed. Just because we all come from different parts of the world and we're all culturally sensitive, it does not translate into we all understand what it means to deal with religious actors. There is a skill that is required. So we use the task force as an opportunity and a forum to provide the skills training to our UN system colleagues together with our faith-based partners. So we don't just convene and talk to one another, but we convene and talk to one another and stand in witness with our faith-based partners so that we can exchange what's good, what's not so good, what do we need to know. We also have become the gateway for many of the faith-based organizations to try to reach out to the UN system. Because we're so complicated and complex, it is not easy for the average faith-based actor to know who to approach in the UN when they wish to do a particular thing. So we've become, as much as possible, that gateway to try to advise, here's who you need to talk to, here's how you can be approached, here's who we can link you to, etc. So we are the diplomatic, but also skills-building bridge inside the UN system. Why did we decide to work with faith-based partners? I'm going to tell you the official spiel, and then I'm going to tell you the real story. The official spiel, you all know very well, which is, of course, what is it now? 8 in 10 people identify with a religious group in this world today. Everybody's religious. Religion matters very much. Religious actors are behavior change influencers. Religious actors are the oldest social service providers known to mankind. Religious actors are the first responders in humanitarian crises. And of course, they're part of the political fabric of many nation states, actually. Yeah? No news there? So what's new? Why are we now engaging with religious actors? The truth is, we started this engagement seriously after September the 11th, 2001. And I'm talking about headquarters United Nations. I'm talking about the United Nations that exists in New York, in Vienna, in Rome. I'm not talking about the United Nations in countries, the operational United Nations, because I'll tell you in a second that when we in UNFPA started to work with religious actors more diligently, we realized that our colleagues in 120 countries were telling us, what, New York has suddenly woken up to the fact that religions exist? But we've been working with them ever since we were created as UN offices. How can you not? How can you not work with religious actors? And my colleagues in UNFPA turned to me and said, even if we would like to avoid them, and believe me, some of us would, but even if we would like to avoid them when we work on reproductive health, you can't avoid the religious actors. They kind of find you. They stalk sometimes. That was the conversation that was had. So what do you mean, have we engaged with religious actors? Can we not? And if we've engaged, then the question was, well, if you've engaged, what have you learned? Why did you do so? What did you learn? And that's the second step. The truth of the matter is that in headquarters, United Nations headquarters, the genuine interest in religious engagement took place after September the 11th, 2001. So with all due respect to the human rights spectrum, to the importance of realizing the SDGs will only happen if we work with religious actors, we've been working with them on the MDGs, we've been working with them systematically, but we started being much more aware and learned and deliberate about the engagement because we suddenly worried about the terrorism agenda. So the insight into why to engage came as a result of the fear about the possibilities of certain religious groups to commit terrorism. And what I'm sharing with you here today is not because I'm representing the United Nations. I'm sharing this with you as a scholar, and therefore I'm telling you a few home truths. Yes, we speak about the importance of religious actors. The truth of the matter is that at the root of our concern is a fear of a certain religious community perpetuating terrorism and violent extremism. And that colors and shades and shapes a lot of the jargon and the approaches and the concerns and the objectives that are used today in terms of engagement. So what's the emerging theory behind this engagement? And again, this is the formal conversation that some of us are trying to instruct one another in, so that we can move away from any prejudice about one particular religious group or community and move towards a more social awareness of why and how we need to engage with religious actors, so that we can move away from a personal relationship with certain experts and specialists and friends whom we will convene around the table to inform our own colleagues, and become much more deliberate and learned and studied about this engagement today in the medium and the long run, so that we can be more strategic in our engagement. So what's the theory? The theory is fundamentally something that the Mormon faith knows very well and can actually instruct on and indeed epitomize. That it is fundamentally about building resilience, the resilience of human beings, because we anticipate that 80% of the challenges for the next few years will be humanitarian in nature. We understand that as a result of everything that's happening around us, and particularly climate change, but also the disintegration of the legitimacy of the nation states, we realize that 80% of the challenges that will confront us will be humanitarian in nature. So now more than ever, the emphasis needs to be on building resilience. In order to build resilience, we know we're confronted with a very real situation, which is epitomized by the 20th and 21st century, which is searing, ridiculous inequalities, including within rich nations. The distance between rich and poor has never been quite as vast. The depth of poverty has never been quite as vast. The intensity and obscenity of wealth in the tiny 0.01% in the world has never been quite as vast. So we realize that inequalities are one of the fundamental, if not the fundamental challenge to resilience in communities. And in order to try to deal with these inequalities, which fundamentally lead to social exclusion and are built on social exclusion and on deepening social exclusionary factors, we have to support and strengthen social inclusion. Approaches within communities, policies that promote social inclusion. So we know that the key thing is we hear a lot about the whole of government, but what we're talking here is a whole of community approach. Because it is a whole of community approach that will quintessentially bring all the actors of that community together. And we realize fundamentally that in order to successfully bring about a whole of community approach, we have to take in and realize that human rights will not be realistically achieved if we don't understand what the cultural, including religious, dynamics are, and what the gender dynamics are. And we're biased a little bit on that because we think that gender and culture and human rights are strongly intertwined, and they are three pillars to a particular chair or stool. And with this, we feed into the social determinants of what any sustainable development agenda, policy framework, international agenda framework needs to be. So this is quintessentially the circle that informs the theory of why we engage. In order to do the whole of community approach, we acknowledge you cannot prioritize any one community over the other. And that's a bit of the sad news, because we know we go from religion is really all bad to religion is really all good. That's grand. Of course, the truth is somewhere in the middle and encompasses the bad and the good. But the truth is religion is not the only actor out there. Even if the 80% of people profess to a faith, religion is not the only dynamic out there. It is one of a significant part of a civic dynamic out there. So if we talk about a whole of community, we cannot afford to prioritize one faith community or only faith communities. With this in mind, what do we feel we've been able to achieve? On the development, humanitarian, and peace and security side, we believe that the only way you can successfully counter anything related to violent extremism, and we don't think of violent extremism as only religious extremism. That's too easy. Violent extremism is gang violence in certain parts of the world. It is weapon-related violence in certain part of the world. and it is religious violence in other parts of the world. Violent extremism is a phenomenon that is not limited to religion. And if we talk about the whole of community approach, we have to talk about the whole of the phenomenon of violent extremism, and understanding and appreciating how that happens and how these things intertwine and engage. But in order to counter the narratives of violent extremism, be they religious or otherwise, what it really takes is to highlight the role that the faith communities, as the oldest social service providers known to humankind, is to highlight and enable and strengthen the social service provision role of these faith-based organizations. We realize that in some countries, the global average for healthcare, let's just take healthcare. The global average for healthcare is 30%. 30% of basic medical services around the world are provided by faith-based organizations. In situations of humanitarian crisis, that figure goes up to something like 70%. We know that in DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Central African Republic, it's 70% of basic healthcare services today, and in the height of the conflict, was provided by faith-based organizations. So it is silly to believe that we're going to support health services in communities and not engage with these faith-based service providers. But if you take that to the education, to the nutrition, to the sanitation, every single area of social life and service, we realize that faith-based organizations are critical service providers. Yes, they are change makers and influencers and behaviors and moral upholders, etc., but they're also providing food, water, shelter, basic needs for people around the world. So therefore, it is important too, if we want to counter the narrative of violent extremism, and we have the theory of social inclusion in mind, and we are thinking of a whole of community approach, we must integrate and support these faith-based organizations in providing the services that they do. And we've done much of this work, and we're continuing to do much of this work, and we can certainly improve upon it. But we also realize that countering the narratives of violent extremism includes targeting hate speech, targeting politics and policies of othering. And some of our UN system colleagues, the UN Office for the Prevention of Genocide and the UN High Commission for Human Rights, have been developing, engaging with faith actors to provide the frameworks, if you will, the roadmaps for how the faith actors themselves, together with other civil society actors, can contribute to the narrative of extremism as it emerges. But it also, interestingly enough, means that we change the way we do our regular business of development. We are learning from faith-based organizations that how they approach communities, for instance, the reliance on religious or sacred text to reach out to religious leaders and other faith-based actors and get them to see the issues of violence, of gender bias, of poverty, of HIV and AIDS, get them to understand the complexity of the issues and the need to reach out in different ways, is based on scriptural texts. We use human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but many of our faith-based providers use religious texts, and that approach is different. So for us to partner means for us to also see how we can merge those two approaches together. It is a different way of doing things. And on human rights, there's a whole range of things that we've also achieved. I'm happy to talk about that later, but just let me quickly tell you some of the challenges that we're learning. We're learning that we lack competency. We lack competency about different religions, knowledge about these different religions, about how they operate, how they work. But we frankly also know that there's a lack of competency and literacy out there within the faith communities about how to work with international mechanisms and intergovernmental mechanisms. So it's not just a one-sided lack of understanding and competency, literacy and competency. It is a two-sided. We need to learn from one another, and there's a lot to learn. We also realize that we keep being told by the faith communities we do not wish to be instrumentalized. We're not there to rubber stamp a UN approach or an EU approach or an AU approach. We're not there to say, yes, good, wonderful, convene us so we can give you the blessings and you can go ahead and do what you want. That's not what we want to do. And that's a very legitimate concern. And it is true, we do use them to come and say, come and tell us what you think we need to do to implement our own agenda, not how can we help you implement the shared agenda. So there is definitely that instrumentalization, but we've learned something else over the last few years. We've learned that as a United Nations system, we can also be instrumentalized by the faith actors. We are now being approached with conditions. You want to work with us? Here are our conditions. We do not wish you to work on A, B, C, or D. We do not wish you to work with E, F, G, H actors. If you want to work with us, here are our terms. So the conditionality is two ways, and the conditionality is the root of the instrumentalization. And how do we then deal with that? Because we open the doors, we normalize the engagement, we normalize the conversation and the discourse, but we can use one another and we are using one another. How do we deal with that? That's another level of competency that we have yet to be informed and engaged about. We work largely with Christian organizations. 90% of our outreach is with Christian organizations. There's a good reason for that. Christian organizations are often organized in very similar ways to intergovernmental mechanisms. There's a clear hierarchy, there's a structure, you know who's in charge of who has which portfolio, who speaks for that community. But I'm sorry, the world is a lot more than that. What do we do with the Muslim communities, with the Hindu communities, with the Buddhist communities? They are not organized in the same way. So we end up finding that there's a tokenism of representation that we do. We engage with Christian specialists, Christian NGOs, Christian secular institutions. We speak the language of interreligious engagement from a Christian perspective that is 90% rooted in the Western Hemisphere. It isn't even a Christian perspective from the rest of the world out there. And that's a huge handicap. And we won't name it. We still continue to speak about religious engagement as though we know what the religious engagement is. It's the Christian world in the Western Hemisphere, truth be told. And last but by no means least, we keep insisting on working with religious leaders. And our religious leaders are incredibly important and vital, but they are not the sum total of communities. Communities are bigger and wider. And think not just the Christian community, think the rest of the communities, faith communities around the world. The leadership doesn't represent the full community and cannot. And if there is one reason behind ISIS, there are many, but if there's one reason behind the emergence of groups like ISIS or Daesh, it is fundamentally that the religious leadership in the Muslim world has failed to be convincing, to be inclusive, to be seen as legitimate articulators and upholders of the faith tradition. So why then would we rush to engage with all the religious leaders? And it is not just the Muslim context. Leadership, religious leadership, it is important. It is not the whole picture by any means. We realize that those we work with in some areas, we can jeopardize because we keep on inviting them to all these events and all these meetings and all these workshops that they kind of eventually end up losing touch with their communities because they're so busy working with intergovernmental organizations and entities. Do we then protect, what can we give back to those same actors who decide to work with us? And we realize that the work of faith-based organizations includes tremendous backbiting, tremendous competitiveness. And now that the issue of religious engagement is so popular, the competition within and between these various faith-based actors is huge. And we are compromised by that competition because we don't quite know how we're going to reach out to who that is not going to end up creating more trouble than it actually has been able to create the social cohesion that we aim for. And last but by no means least, we realize that there is not so much just a normalization of the engagement, but there is a lot of suspicion that is coming to the fore. And the suspicion that is coming to the fore has to do with the fact that we're working on interreligious engagement agenda, but we're using sources, resources that are Christian-centric and Western-centric. And when we look today to realize who the spokespersons, the authorities of religious engagement in development and international affairs are, we are invariably soliciting the same group of experts from Western institutions who come and tell us about how we should be engaging and what are the lessons learned. And those of us, and this is a very personal note I end up on, those of us who come from the other part of the world, who don't come from a Christian tradition or a Jewish tradition, end up being very easily overlooked because this is not the voice of truth. The voice of truth looks in a certain way, speaks in a certain way, comes from a certain part of the world, and comes from a certain religion. Those are the voices of truth. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this symposium. And my thanks go especially to my friends Cole Durham and Brett Sharfs and the entire team here at BYU Law. This symposium, I think we're all aware of this, but I think it bears worth stating. This symposium is so very important, given the need for increased academic engagement within the disciplines of law and the social sciences on the role of religion in our world today. As Jan Fiegel put it so aptly at our opening plenary session last evening, we must fight against these three expressions of evil in our world today: ignorance, indifference, and fear. And I hope to present to you today some ways in which we can combat the ignorance and indifference that all too often characterizes the responses of Western governments and their foreign services to religious freedom and more broadly to the role of religion and religious faith in geopolitics. So my presentation today really represents some initial thoughts of mine, drawing upon my own experience in the Canadian Foreign Service. As I re-enter academic life again, my intention is to explore these issues more deeply in my own research, and I think there's a crying need for more research on the whole issue of how our foreign services are shaped and formed, often without any knowledge of religion. So this presentation focuses on the impact of an increasingly closed secular society, and in particular secular curricula in post-secondary education and in the professional formation of foreign policy actors in Western democracies. And what I want to argue is that this is linked to how we approach questions of security. I want to argue that the more or less complete lack of formation on religion and its role in the world, specifically how it interacts with geopolitics and international relations, severely limits the ability of foreign policy actors to act in an informed and nuanced way in the world. It constrains them in engaging those countries where religion informs deeply both political action and socio-economic discourse. Indeed, I would say that foreign policy actors today in Western democracies exhibit a frequent willful disregard, what we might term indifference if we're being polite, for the profound influence of religious belief in much of the world and how such belief shapes political action. This ignorance and indifference can restrict the effectiveness of diplomatic responses to global security concerns. If the religious beliefs of individuals in a particular society and how those beliefs inform their actions is not understood, then this ignorance and often indifference of foreign policy actors will greatly limit their diplomatic efforts. And I can bear witness to this in my own experience. Such ignorance and indifference is, I would say, especially concerning given the serious violations of religious freedom which continue to pose a grave challenge to human security, geopolitical stability, and social and economic development in many countries. And we're all well aware of the statistics. I'm not going to belabor those. Jan Fiegel reminded us last night. So let me now move on to what I see as some of the pitfalls of closed secularism on foreign policy in engaging religion. And here I'm speaking of closed secularism with a nod to my compatriot Charles Taylor, as that which seeks to exclude religious belief from the public square, including public policy, by imposing a secular belief system. This as opposed to a more open secularism, where the state is neutral in matters of religious faith, and I would argue even more, permits expressions of religious belief, including in the realm of public policy, where public policy actually welcomes an awareness of religious belief, and even people that are public policy actors or foreign policy actors can be informed by their religious tradition. Right now, this is pretty much forbidden, implicitly, if not explicitly. I'll argue that a closed secularist mindset, which is increasingly pervasive within government institutions in Western democracies, in many Western democracies, including my own, has limited the ability of foreign policy actors to speak publicly about religion, to understand the role of religion in international relations, and therefore made it more of a challenge to advance religious freedom as a core foreign policy goal. And here I want to explicitly link the advancement of religious freedom with approaches to security concerns in the world. And again, I want to try and illustrate some of these pitfalls of a closed secularist approach, drawing from my experience as ambassador for religious freedom in Canada. So I didn't put this on a nice handy PowerPoint for you, so I want you to, I'm going to repeat these a couple times, but focus in. I would argue that there are six characteristics of Western democracies' approaches to diplomatic engagement on religion and religious freedom that reflect the indifference and ignorance that I raised at the top. Number one, an inability among foreign policy actors to speak publicly about religion. Number two, an inability to converse in a meaningful and informed way with faithful people about their beliefs and how they shape their actions. Number three, religion is not viewed as an important factor in foreign policy by many foreign policy actors in Western democracies. And I call this the mirror syndrome, where we take our Western approach of a sort of a secular, closed secular approach, and we impose that on the rest of the world. Fourth, an ignorance, often willful, among foreign policy actors of religious communities and their plight, stemming principally from weak undergraduate, postgraduate, and diplomatic formation. Fifth, the denial of religious freedom violations, cloaking them instead as violations of other freedoms, conforming more to the closed secular worldview. It's much easier, I think, for a lot of foreign policy actors to speak about violations of freedom of expression or freedom of assembly or freedom of association than actually saying freedom of religion. And finally, a desire among foreign policy actors to be balanced and fair when speaking of persecution, without any nuance as to proportionality, thus relativizing suffering and persecution. So let me now proceed to examine each one of these in turn. So, an inability among foreign policy actors to speak publicly about religion. Let me give you a concrete example from my own experience. Each year as ambassador, I was asked to speak to our outgoing heads of mission in the Canadian Foreign Service, ambassadors, high commissioners, consuls, and to talk about the role of the Office of Religious Freedom and how we would be engaging them. In my first year of doing this, I spoke to a group of approximately 25 outgoing heads of mission. And at that, I spoke about the role of the Office of Religious Freedom, our mandate to uphold and promote religious freedom, combating religious persecution as part of our human rights policy. I talked about the programming activities that we would be involved in. And I kept it at a very basic level. It was a new office, and so I wanted to keep people informed. But one of our outgoing heads of mission, who went on to serve in Manila, said, well, Ambassador Bennett, you're a devout Christian. How does that inform your approach to your post, to religious freedom? And so I spoke as a Christian about the whole idea of human dignity that Jan Fiegel spoke to us about last night. And human dignity is being grounded in the incarnation. And I spoke about Christian theology, Catholic theology. And I kept it, again, fairly basic, and he prompted me and said, tell us more about how your faith shapes your views. And so I did. After that, independently of each other, 6 of those outgoing heads of mission came up to me and said, I wish I could say that. I wish I could speak about my faith publicly. I wish my faith would allow me to inform my diplomatic action. And I found repeatedly in my work that my colleagues, even if they were faithful people in some cases, did not want to talk about religion in their professional work, despite the fact they were being posted to countries where they would have to do that. Otherwise, they would be unable to understand a lot of what was happening around them. The second characteristic I mentioned, an inability to converse in a meaningful and informed way with faithful people about their beliefs and how they shape their actions. Our foreign policy actors and people in our foreign services are not well formed, as I said, in matters of religious faith. We often talk about this being an ignorance in areas of religious literacy. Religious literacy, I think we can sort of argue, is about here's what different faiths believe, here's maybe how they act on those beliefs in their everyday lives. But I think often religious literacy forgets a very key element, and that is faith literacy. Why do these people believe what they believe? Why do they consult Scripture instead of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when they're engaging the UN? Why is that the case? And I remember when I first began, part of my mandate was to engage religious communities in Canada, to meet religious leaders in Canada. I had no domestic mandate, but I needed to meet with the different religious leaders in our country who were concerned about what was happening overseas. And inevitably, those meetings would begin with me explaining my role and the role of the office. And they would see me as, well, here's this ambassador, here's a public servant, we need to engage him and talk to him, and we need our concerns to be heard by him. But when they found out that I was actually a devout Catholic, all of the barriers came down. And we were able to engage in a much deeper way on questions of faith, not simply on the level of foreign policy. But even though we had often radically different beliefs, whether I was engaging with Hindus or Jews or Buddhists or Baha'is, whatever it might be, even though we might have had very different beliefs, they recognized that somehow this guy gets it, that religion matters and faith matters to a lot of people and that matters to us. And so the conversations that we were able to have, there was an immediate trust that was established. And that, I think, is very important, as any foreign policy actor will tell you, to have a certain element of trust in the people that you're engaging with overseas. Third, religion is not viewed as an important factor in foreign policy. And I said this is the mirror syndrome, where we seek to impose our image onto other countries. And this was raised by our first presenter. In the Foreign Service of Canada, I think it's fairly safe to say there is a colossal ignorance of Islam. I would say most of my colleagues know that there's Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. But then to ask them to understand that there are different schools within Sunni Islam, that Shia Islam is divided between the majority 12 are Shia and 7 are Shia, the Ismailis, who are the Ahmadiyya, who are Sufis, how do they play, what is the nature of the conflict within Islam, how does that impact geopolitics, putting aside extremism questions, what is the impact of Wahhabi Islam being exported to countries and regions where it has no roots, Central Asia, where the Hanafi school is more dominant? They are not able to be conversant in this. And I can remember a specific incident. I was invited, along with many other foreign diplomats, foreign ministers, to a conference organized by the French government and the Jordanian government in the autumn of 2015. And we had a large plenary session in which foreign ministers, different religious leaders from the Middle East spoke about the situation in the Middle East, spoke about the persecution taking place against Christians, Yazidis, Mandeans, Sunni Shia Muslims who refused to accede to the views of ISIS. And all the different foreign policy actors, the foreign ministers, the diplomats that were there, talked a lot about how this is really a very dire situation. But there wasn't much discussion of action. And there was a very surface level understanding as to what was happening. It was a humanitarian crisis. We needed to respond to the humanitarian crisis without an understanding of what was it that caused this humanitarian crisis. Why did this persecution erupt? What's the source of this persecution? And the representative of Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani from Najaf in Iraq, Shia representative, his representative came, and this Ayatollah spoke for no more than 3 minutes. And at the end he said, all of you are speaking here as if Islam is not part of the issue. Islam is part of the issue, he said. He hopped on the elephant in the room and he rode it around a couple of times as everybody stared at their papers and didn't know what to say, because it was a bit uncomfortable to be confronted by a prominent Muslim leader saying, you don't understand what's happening within Islam at this moment, the conflicts that exist within Islam. You need to understand that. Fourth, there's often an ignorance, often willful, among foreign policy actors of religious communities and their plight, stemming principally from a weak diplomatic formation. When Mosul fell to ISIS towards the end of 2013, I engaged my colleagues in the Middle East desk in our foreign service, at our foreign ministry, my colleagues that are engaged in aid, humanitarian relief, and I said, we're going to have a coherent response to the persecutions taking place in Iraq and in Syria. How do we respond to the situation facing Yazidis and Mandeans, the situation facing Christians and other Muslim groups? And my colleagues responded back saying, the who? The Yazidis? Who are they? Who are the Mandeans? And I tried to explain who these groups were. And they said, well, we understand Christians. Catholics and Lutherans and Presbyterians and Anglicans, and I said, no. No, these Christians are the ancient apostolic churches of the Middle East, the Chaldeans, the Assyrian Church of the East, which at one point had churches in China, the Syriac Orthodox Church. And I was met with blank stares. I said, these are the indigenous people of Iraq and the indigenous people of Syria. And so my colleagues felt they didn't need to know about this. They didn't need to be aware of this. But we tried through training to educate them somewhat. And there was a desire amongst some of them to understand, but many of them thought we can just focus on the humanitarian crisis. This is not a religious issue. This is not religious persecution, it's a humanitarian crisis. Let's not talk about religion. Another incident was a conversation I had with a high commissioner, Canadian high commissioner, who had served in many parts of the Middle East and South and Southeast Asia. And she had at that time was in a position in a predominantly Muslim country where there's a fairly significant amount of persecution of different groups, including non-believers and atheists. And we had had a number of projects operating in this country. And I had a conversation with this High Commissioner when they were back in Ottawa for a visit, talking about some of the effectiveness of these programs. And the High Commissioner mentioned that they had met with the bishop of a particular city. And I said, oh, was that the Catholic bishop or the Anglican bishop? And the response coming from one of our most established diplomats was, oh, I'm an agnostic, I don't know the difference. And I thought that would be like me as a bishop in that country, having said that, oh, I met one of your ministers who came to visit. Oh, was that the foreign minister or the minister of international development? Oh, I'm a bishop, I'm not a political scientist, I don't know the difference. You would think the man was a bit simple. But this was an acceptable response. The denial of religious freedom violations and cloaking them instead of as violations of another freedom. The case of Raif Badawi in Saudi Arabia, a liberal Muslim championed by many in the atheist and secular humanist community, persecuted for what he had to say in his blog, persecuted for his beliefs, and now continues to languish in a Saudi prison. My colleagues did not want to talk about that as a religious freedom violation. It was freedom of expression. No, we can't speak about it as religious freedom, ambassador. We have to talk about freedom of expression. And I said, but he has to express something. And what he's expressing are his beliefs. So we need to address it together. Religious freedom, as was rightly pointed out, cannot exist as a freedom on its own. It interacts with other freedoms. But you need to be able to think before you can act. And that was a challenge continually. Finally, a desire among foreign policy actors to be balanced and fair when speaking of persecution without any nuance as to proportionality, thus relativizing suffering and persecution. The Government of Canada has still refused to speak about genocide in the context of the Middle East. A Yazidi genocide, a Christian genocide. We heard it again last night. How often do we say never again? It's very empty. And I'm sad to say that our government still has not addressed this issue. We don't want to single out certain groups because we feel if we single out certain groups, we're not speaking about the other groups, despite the fact that Yazidis and Christians in the Middle East are disproportionately facing persecution. But we don't want to talk about that because we sense that we're being unfair. And as Canadians, this is a particular challenge we have with certain pathology around being unfair, around being impolite. But we need to deal with the reality on the ground. All of these pitfalls that I raise can individually or collectively constrain a willingness to take action to address security risks. They can lead to delayed responses that are only taken when a crisis erupts, when the security risks could have been mitigated by being able to assess the risks and understand how the principal actors might respond in certain situations. It perpetuates a diplomatic blind spot within foreign ministries and governments when it comes to engaging the vast majority of the world that is religious. How do we address some of these things? I only have a little bit of time, so I'm just going to speak about a few. The inability among foreign policy actors to speak publicly about religion. this is hard to address. Based on more than a century of retreat of religion into a privatized space in many of our Western democracies, we need to embrace a deep pluralism where we recognize the value of difference, to find ways to carve out greater space in the public square for religious voices. Secondly, an inability to converse in a meaningful way amongst our foreign policy actors with faithful people. We need to support genuine religious engagement by foreign service officers and civil servants generally. We need to draw upon religious people within the foreign service, give them a voice, engage foreign service officers that they can witness people of faith at worship as they engage one another. In conclusion, I want to just sum up by saying, how do we address the challenges in our universities, our foreign relations schools? I would make a plea that through this engagement that we're doing here today, our academic inquiry not be simply or exclusively a distant and disengaged critical analysis of religion via the disciplines of sociology, psychology, religious studies, or any other social scientific line of inquiry for that matter. Too often the metaphysical and the transcendent is dispensed with as falling outside of critical analysis, according to accepted quantitative and qualitative methodologies. If we are to understand why what people believe causes them to do tremendous good or tremendous evil, or to simply live according to their deep faith, we need to adopt a more classical approach to higher education, that alongside critical social scientific inquiry, we re-engage philosophy, theology, logic, rhetoric, among other disciplines. And finally, in much of the world, religion is not simply an element of culture, best kept behind closed doors, either those of the home or those of the church, the mosque, the gurdwara, the temple. We in North America and Western Europe are the outliers. The vast majority of the societies in Latin America, Eurasia, Africa, South and Southeast Asia are deeply religious. To put it succinctly, our foreign policy and its practitioners need to get religion. Thank you.
This is the point I dreaded, because I'm now speaking after Azza, who I hugely admire, and who in an organization that has many more members than the EU is achieving great progress. Speaking after Andrew, who doesn't have PowerPoints, but a very well-written statement. But thank God before Khalid. So I wanted to say that I'm very honored to be here, and I want to thank you for the invitation. I thought yesterday was a great introduction, and I was very impressed by the messages that we heard from the General Conference, and I have increased my knowledge by probably 200% about the activities of BYU, even if I am familiar with your good work, both the devotion and the depth of your engagement, but also by the diversity of people around I was going to say around the table, but in this amphitheater. And that made me change my presentation. So I scrapped the one that would otherwise have maybe helped the interpreters to talk to you about what we do. Because apparently we're not quite as good as the UN, but we're faring much better than Canada. So, by way of introduction, I thought it'd be useful, because we don't all know where we come from. People have an idea of what the UN is, but the EU is a funny animal and a bit of a complex animal as well. We yesterday had the great pleasure of hearing the Commission's Special Envoy Jan Fiegel talk about the centrality and the challenges of freedom of religion and belief. He encouraged us to revisit secularism. I'll come to that in a minute. You will later today hear from my excellent colleague from the European Parliament, Fergus O'Barra, who is responsible for the religious engagement or the consultation of confessional and non-confessional voices on EU matters. And then you have this organization from where I come, which has the awful title of the European External Action Service, because the UK didn't want to call us a foreign office. And We are the foreign policy branch of the EU, so if you want the kind of State Department. My boss and the person who we work for is the High Representative Vice President Mogherini, who is corresponding to Tillerson, except she also reports to and represents 28 member states. And that brings me in. I'm a Danish diplomat, so I'm one of these poor people who neither get religion nor academia. And I am a very small bolt in the system, but the good thing is I've been around for a long time, so I know how the system is. And because I'm Danish, I believe in Lego blocks and the power of Lego blocks and how you can build if you have great ideas and can build coalitions on the inside. I am today one of the driving forces, and I say that with humility but also pride, in what we have achieved in our capacity building and raising of general awareness of what, where, and how religion matters. Because it's not just a given, and I'll come to that, but even for diplomats, this is something we need to get our head around. We need to get our head around how to navigate the political religious landscape, and we need to do so with eyes wide open. 2 weeks ago, I had the pleasure of responding to who in the US I understand is a lightning rod for most of you, Elizabeth Shackham-Hurd on religious freedom. And I'll come to that later. Her argument was the opposite of Andrew's. She basically says that diplomats are academic light, they don't get religion, so they should stay out of it. I don't think so, but I don't think Andrew's entirely right either. Anyway, one final introductory point, because EU is, again, different, and it's probably far away from a good number of you, but I think the European touch is worth mentioning in terms of how we do religion. For us, it has two legs. It has one on which we base a lot of attention, which is freedom of religion or belief. The B is tremendously important for us. It's also important to note that for us, it's an embedded right. It's not a standalone right. So we have no ambassador at large for religious freedom. We do have an EU special representative for human rights. And now, thank God, we also have Fiegel. So in a way, we're doing much better than the US. I'm looking at the bright sides here. But it has a second entry point, and it's one that's often forgotten, because very often religion gets reduced to freedom of religion, just like religion sometimes gets reduced to Islam. I'll come to that also. So we also are stepping up our religious engagement. I have done so with enthusiasm and humility. We know what we don't know, don't worry. And in that sense, we have been working very closely with this office in the State Department called the Office of Religion and Global Affairs. Before I turn to trying to show you what we managed with our Lego blocks, let me just say, because I need to do a bit of spiel, like Azza says, that one of the things that we have really done well are the guidelines. And I don't know if you've heard about our guidelines on freedom of religion or belief. And if you don't, and if you haven't, you're not the only ones, because we spent a lot of time writing them, only to recognize 2 years later that even our own people didn't know they existed. So we are now, with the help of Fiegel and with the help of people in our service who work on freedom of religion or belief more narrowly, working hard to make sure that everybody knows what a great steering manual this is for the EU and its member states. It sets out the basic principles of action, it sets out the priority areas of action and the tools of action, whether the violations are by state authorities or by non-state actors. They were adopted in 2013 by EU 28, so it's a solid document. These things are important, especially when you try to herd cats like the EU 28. It reaffirms our commitment to promote and protect. We've translated into all our languages, our working languages within the EU, plus Russian, Arabic, and one fails me, it'll come back. What's important is that it's freedom of religion or belief for all. It's the rights of all individuals to believe or not to believe, and that we carry out this mandate in a way by which we are impartial and not aligned with any specific religion. However strong a policy or however solid a guideline document, it's the delivery that counts, and that's why I agree with Andrew. And here we still have a lot of work to do. We are working on the awareness among all our actors, including people in headquarters. We are also asking ourselves whether the way in which we deliver this policy is the right one. And I'll touch upon that later this week in DC, where we're going to talk about the transatlantic challenges. But let me just say for you that it's very important that this is the musketeer spirit, one for all for one. We need to build broad coalitions. We need to engage more actively beyond government circles. We are a government institution. We tend to feel more comfortable speaking to governments. We need to strengthen the cooperation and dialogue with civil society groups, including those from different faiths. We are getting better at it, and I will be happy to provide some examples of that. And then, in terms of the all for one, we need to improve the cross-solidarity. Having Jewish communities fighting anti-Semitism, Muslims fighting against anti-Muslim hatred, and some would say the Christians fighting for the religious freedom is no way of building a coalition. We should always remember that religious freedom is a universal principle, not an expression of identity politics. It's a challenge for us all. It'll be a challenge for Ambassador at Large Brownback in his work. But finally, we need to remember that we need to practice what we preach. And here I just want to read out one quote from our global strategy. We spent great length at writing up what we think is our role in the world, and we presented this paper symbolically, but also totally coincidentally, the day of the UK referendum on Brexit. It says, "The EU will foster the resilience of its democracies and live up to the values that has inspired its creation and development. These include respect for and promotion of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law. They encompass justice, solidarity, equality, non-discrimination, pluralism, respect for diversity." And here comes the punchline. "Living up consistently to our values internally will determine our external credibility and influence." I don't think it can be said much clearer. This makes me turn to what is going to be the main sort of me telling you what it is we do. Why is religion relevant for diplomacy, and why do we need to get our head around it? We have tried to operate around some core principles that I will quickly flash out before telling you concretely what it is that we are then doing inside to become sharper, better, and more religious literate. Am I speaking too fast? Okay. We do navigate the religious political landscape, even with partial and non-perfect skill set. We do try to understand the religious dynamics, and we do engage religious actors, even if not full spectrum. Point number one, and that's something that I sometimes find missing in debates on religious freedom or FORB, is we need to acknowledge that religion is relevant to many foreign policy priorities, not just those who are tied to religion. Religion, and there Elizabeth Shackham-Hurd is right, religion is not static, religion is a lived thing, and many of you are the expression of that. And one of the concrete challenges I get when we have people coming to the EAS wanting to talk to us, like the Grand Mufti of Bosnia or a cross-section of religious leaders from Georgia, is to tell my colleagues that they may be religious leaders, but they don't want to talk to you about religion. They want to talk to you about politics. They want to talk to you about domestic concerns, international concerns. So when we had the Grand Mufti of Bosnia, He wanted, of course, to talk about certain issues in Bosnia related to what he sees as a threat coming from outside Bosnia, not just from Saudi, but also from other countries. I did not mention Turkey and Serbia, but let they be said. But most of all, he wanted to talk about EU accession. He wants Bosnia into the EU. And for my colleagues, much of that was a surprise. They think, oh, if you're religious, you want to talk about interfaith dialogue. And then they turn to me, and I then instantly turn to someone else, because I think it's sometimes a little bit passé, especially for diplomats to get involved in. And the same thing for these leaders we had from Georgia. And that's where we need to sharpen our religious tool set, but we also need to know that it's not because you're religious you want to talk about religion. Secondly, and that's a very important point, we need to right-size the role of religion. Religion is not always about adding religion to the picture or emphasize its importance, as both Jan Fiegel and I think Andrew, you just said. Religion is not the fix-all. It's not the magic bullet after which you understand the world as it is. Religion can also be the Vaseline on the lens that makes you go wrong. And one of these areas where we see we pay too much attention to religion is on what Azza correctly said, violent extremism. Why is it we reduce it to being a problem of bad Islam? Why is it we fail to see that understanding the drivers of radicalization means you need to look at a big box of structural drivers, a sort of medium-sized box of why is it it affects some individuals and not others, so what is it on their individual pathway that makes it click? And then there's a smaller box in which religion does fit, because it would be wrong to exonerate religion altogether. The meeting with a charismatic imam or something you see on the internet, etc. But by going in first, making it about religion, and to be more precisely Islam, we run the risk of doing the work for ISIS for them. We drive a cleavage down between them and us, and that's something where I think, thanks to the good work we've done also with State Department colleagues, we have made some headway on our learning curve as to what kind of course correction we need to do there. So after having stated that religion is relevant for more than just one thing, that we need to right-size the role, we need to do so our engagement eyes wide open. And that bears to a point that Azza already said. I could make this much shorter, but now that I've written down Azza, I'm sorry. Formal religious authorities are the ones that know our email address, are the ones that know how to knock on our front door. That's not always to say that they are the only ones, let alone the most important ones to talk to. We have a lot of less visible and more marginalized voices that we engage with and that we need to engage with. We need also, and that's where I think, Andrew, you were onto something, take a closer look at ourselves and how our combination of mindset and skill set sometimes leads us to have certain blind spots. I probably shouldn't say that, but my husband thinks I'm a fraud, and he thinks I shouldn't be here because I know so precious little about religion. And I tell him that's precisely why I'm good at my work, because I know what I don't know, and I know where to turn. Part of what I have been trying to do within the EU, which is, and we should make no apology of that, a secular organization. I would be very worried if someone were to ask us in our individual capacity to speak up about our own religious preferences. But we should be able to grasp that our world view is not necessarily one that is making much sense outside the Brussels Ring Road. And we are quite shaped by the French administrative DNA, which has a very particular way of looking at religion. But I would like to say that I think we've moved beyond the view of religion as just seen as an epiphenomenon, or at best an irritant, but really trying to engage. And I will now turn to what I probably should have started by saying, what is it then we do? We have within the EAS and with partners in the Commission and Parliament developed a program to challenge and further develop our mindset and skill sets. We run various trainings. And we have two modules in particular that are immensely popular. So it's for a continent which Professor Casanova says we have a fear of religion. I can tell you it's a very popular domain. One is religion and foreign policy more broadly, where we look at religions and their worldviews. We don't go much into theology, and I don't think should be our role either. But we give our colleagues enough background to be able to deal with the context where they sit. I'll give you a couple of examples. We have worked, of course, a lot on Islam because we're obsessed with Islam. We like to learn more about Islam. But we also looked at what happens when other religions radicalizes. Hinduism, Buddhism. And to our surprise, our colleagues are much less interested in that than Islam. I think there's a little message there. We've also looked at our own worldviews. We brought in Professor Casanova, and it was very interesting to hear how especially the French colleagues among us were challenged by what he had to say, but it turned out to be a very productive conversation. So we look also at our own mindset. We've even looked at Judaism and the worldview that stems from that, which is something where it starts getting a little bit itchy. I'd also like to add that thanks to the training we've been doing, we've now managed to get other DGs warmed up. So we now have the commission responsible for development now doing training for the role of religion in development, where we pulled in Azza Karam. The second tier of instruments we have are our networking. 2 points there. I've constituted a task force inside the EAS on religion and culture. At the beginning, we called it the God Squad, but that didn't go down well, so we changed the name. And the point is, we really want to challenge each other and the sort of busting the silos that exist within a big ministry like ours. Because if you sit and deal with the Middle East and North Africa, you are convinced that's the center of world affairs, and your reading of center of world affairs is just how it is, and the others just need to catch up. Well, we've seen the good in really sort of challenging each other. But in addition to that, we've set up a policy network across the Atlantic, the Transatlantic Policy Network on Religion and Development. We didn't have the originality of finding a shorter title. But I can reassure you, Andrew, Canada is in. We even have USA. We have 10 EU member states, not 28, because not all equally interested or have the resources. And we have Switzerland. Switzerland makes a big difference because it allows us also to look at some of the experience they're allowed to do due to their more open engagement policy. What have we done? We have exposed our best and worst practices. It stays between us, so it's a good area to talk. We have commissioned policy papers, the role of Orthodox churches in the crisis of Ukraine, Religious Track 2 on Iran, the do's and don'ts on CVE, how do we understand the Vatican policy, countering violent extremism. But also we work in between our meetings, and I must say there is starting to be a learning curve. So I'm less pessimistic. I see a huge need for doing more, but I think we should also acknowledge when progress is made. And that is where I will end and conclude and say that engagement with religion and religious actors needs to become routine, needs to become a standard practice of our diplomatic toolkit, not because religion is the new black or sexy or back, because religion has been there all along, but simply and pragmatically because religion matters and always has. We don't do this to increase the role of religion or outsource our work to other actors, but we do it because it makes us better at advancing our foreign policy objectives. And I think we should make no secret of that. And I will, ironically, give the last word to Elizabeth Shackham-Hurd and say, we need to be humble and acutely aware of what we don't know, And we need to connect better and faster to the world of applied academia and diplomacy, who will always be, we diplomats will always be journalists and not specialists and not religious, actors in our own right. So for us, the fact of being academic light is a working condition, but not an excuse for not getting engaged. So with this, I thank you, and sorry if it was a bit long. I saw the 2 minutes, but I decided to ignore it. Thank you.
Good morning. Salam Alaikum. I am a Muslim, but a bit different. Not because I don't want to show solidarity with the rest of Muslims, but just because all Muslims, you won't find two Muslims that are alike. All Muslims are different from each other, as all Christians, all Jews, all Buddhists, and so on. We are different. I spent the last 20 years traveling between East and West, or between the world, between the Arabic world, Islamic world, and Europe, to the extent that I cannot find myself. Sometimes, as I started learning German, I discovered that we live in different worlds, because the topic of our panel is world, in a changing world. So I realized that we live in different worlds. When I wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning, a German would ask me, wie spät ist es? How late it is? And I would say, why not reformulate, reshape the question? Why not say how early it is? So I started that our rapport, our relationship to time is different. Then when someone tells me, see you tomorrow, that's shocking. See you tomorrow, are you sure? It is conditional. See you tomorrow if there is no earthquake, if the bus doesn't, it is something conditional. You cannot be sure to see me tomorrow. So that's the world from where I come. My world is different from the world from Europe. I belong to another world. But it requires a lot of intellectual energy to harmonize the two belongings. If you don't have it, and unfortunately most of our religious leaders don't have it, because they come from a background which is not too much intellectual. They belong to, a reality of migration decides on the course they take. When someone tells me le monde in French, the mundus, the Latin word mundus, it is as opposed to immundus, the beautiful totality, as opposed to the ugly totality. Cosmos stems from cosmetics, or the same root as cosmetics, to beautiful totality as chaos. So in European culture, and according to European languages, I must polarize. But when I say the word alam in Arabic, it stems from the same root as alama, which means sign. Tu'allim, it teaches. Tu'lim, it hints. So the world in my language is seen differently. The world is something that hints. I feel that this belonging, this double belonging, is very, very enriching for me. I see the world from different perspectives. How can we harmonize this double belonging? It reminds me of E.M. Forster, who after a long experience in India, he ended up saying, I think that most Indian, like most British, are shit, He couldn't harmonize this double belonging. But I said, no. Let's not succumb to pessimism, but try to work hard in order to harmonize the two worlds we belong to. In the world I came from, where I lived as a child, so public space is religious. And if you are not religious, then you have to go private. But when I came to Europe, public space is not religious. If you are religious, you have to go private. So how can we harmonize these total conceptions of and visions of the world and trends? This is a challenge that we are facing, not as individuals, but as communities as well. It requires a lot of intellectual energy and readiness to learn from one another and to approach other ways of thinking, of speaking, and so on. It requires a lot of intellectual energy. And of course, it requires wisdom. Wisdom in Arabic, al-hikmah, hakama, stems from the bit that you put on the horse's mouth to curb it. Al-Hakim is the one who curbs his passions when these passions reach the utmost height. So to be wise is to be able to curb one's passions. From a psychological point of view, that we have to outgrow some religious frameworks in order to get into a space of wisdom. Yes. So, the title, In a Changing World, the world has never ceased to change. The world is always changing. So it is our perception of it. Either we see it as changing or we see that we are controlling it. It is under control. When we say the world is changing, it means that we are no longer controlling the situation. That's our case today. When we say religion and stability and security in a changing world, well, it means that we are no longer secure and we are insecure and we feel that we don't grasp reality as it is. This is why we speak in terms of a changing world. But the world has never ceased to change. The German philosopher Heidegger says, Die Welt weltet, the world whirls. And there are other languages when you cannot say, I cannot say in Arabic, I am Khalid. My language doesn't allow for it. I say, I Khalid. It is a different system of we have 13 verbs of the equivalent to the verb to be. To be in the morning, to be afternoon, to be in, it portrays being in movement. So you cannot say what is the world. You cannot say what is the world. But you say what is the world doing. It is the philosophy of doing and not of being. So what counts for religious people is not who we are. We spent 20 years working on themes like Islam and women, Islam and democracy, Islam and so on, and Islam and that. To prove what? To prove that our vision of these things is the best. That's nonsense. Because what counts from a religious point of view is what you do. Even the Quran says, you shall return to God and He shall judge what you did and not who you are. Samuel Huntington wanted to reduce us to conflicting entities. We are obliged to conflict, to get in clash with one another because we are different. Your essence is different from my essence, then this necessarily leads to a clash of civilizations. But you can find verses in Holy Scriptures and in the Quran that says the contrary. What counts is not who you are. I am proud of being American, proud of being Moroccan, proud of being Christian, proud of being Muslim. And then what? Nothing. What counts is what you do. So this leads us to common action. Instead of talking about Christians and the family, or Muslims and the family, Jews and the family, secularists and the family, to prove what? If your intention is to prove that we are the best, we have the best conception of these things, that's, in my opinion, that's a sort of chauvinism which leads to no avail. We have to concentrate on common action. What we do in the European Council of Moroccan Ulema is to try to introduce imams to Western culture. How Westerners think, how Europe, the European context, how the Europeans perceive, what is their vision of the world, how to interact with Western European reality, which of course requires a bit of philosophy, philosophical knowledge, and some diving into the humanities and so on. What is the problem? The problem is that the youth, the Muslim youth in Europe, they live their religion or religiosity as a burden and not as a spiritual, lever, but as a burden. I know young people who were very, very cool, but once they converted to religion, they become, very, very, they live religion as a burden. So this is queer, this is strange. What's the problem? The problem is that we keep asking the wrong questions. You would come across people who would tell you, am I allowed to wish Happy Christmas to my Christian neighbor? And you would find theologians who would come with all the goodwill to explain, yes, in the text it is said you have to be caring for your neighbor and the prophet, this. I say that this is nonsense. The question is false. You have to reframe the question. You have to give the young people a framework of questioning, a new framework to ask new questions and not to indulge in silly questions. And if you indulge in answering these questions, then you have lost the battle. You have lost the battle. So we try to accompany imams in order to help them reformulate, reshape questions, find out questions that are pertinent to the context in which we live. Why? Because with the end of Revelation, this is what we try to convey to the imams. When the revelation ended, the revelation unfolded itself in time. So the prophet was giving the order of the day to his disciples, do this and don't do that. Because the text unfolds itself in a linear, in time. But we have inherited a text. We have inherited a text with page number 1, page number 2, page number 3. If I want to extract an avis juridique or a legal opinion from the text, I have to assume my moral responsibility because I'm comparing the pages. I am comparing between page 1, page 2, page 3. I'm doing a combination. This combination is not divine. It is human. So I have to assume moral responsibility and not to ascribe or assign my deeds to the text. That is immoral. That is immorality. So we have to teach young people. We are trying to teach young people in Europe and imams to teach young people that they have a moral responsibility to assume. The text does not tell you to kill. The text does not tell you to wish Happy Christmas to your neighbor. The text does not tell you these things. You have to assume your moral responsibility. The fact that you are a human being and you ask such silly questions, then you are, maybe there is a problem. Not with religion, but with yourself. So we are helping imams to grapple, to understand the context in which they live. It's not always easy because living together requires efforts from all the constituents of society. Even Europeans must take a step towards the Muslim community and learn what is Islam and Muslims and so on, and not to see the Muslims as a fanatic entity, for instance. It is not productive. We need to work together. Common action is required. Common action is required to guarantee, to reach some, good living together. We are destructing certain mechanisms. If you give a topic to an imam, for instance, or to a cleric, to a theologian, his mind functions according to certain mechanisms. If you tell him, for instance, democracy, well, the first step to do is to find an equivalent to democracy in the Quran. For instance, give it a name, Shura, for instance. Some people would say Shuracracy, in order to give it some Islamic hue. And another mechanism is to go back to history and find a similar context that would show that we have democracy. And of course, by these two mechanisms, what do? We sanctify democracy, which is not sanctified as it is practiced it is something practical, in progress, in becoming. It's not complete. Even Democrats won't pretend that democracy is complete. It is something in becoming. So you end up sanctifying something which is not sacred. And at the same time, what you do, you freeze it into history. And at the end of the day, you are not in harmony with the spirit of the times. You are excluded out of history. You don't belong to Europe. You don't belong to the world. You become a fanatic. You become a sort of, I'm using the word Puritanism not in the American sense, but in the Islamic sense. Young people who cannot identify, who don't have a belonging, who have a problem of harmonizing believing and belonging, and they end up in a puritanical position, searching for a land which is barren, land where there is nobody else to implement their vision of religion. They don't belong to a tradition of living within, no, they seek some concepts that are abstract, having nothing to do with the family context, with tradition, and nothing to do with the modern reality in which they live. So the task is not easy. We are constructing certain mechanisms, and these mechanisms, hopefully, they would lead, they are helpful when it comes to, smoothing the path of living together. I have 2 minutes left. So, we in Europe, I'm going to skip some certain points. Unfortunately, it is the irony of history and of destiny. 20 years ago, in the Islamic and Arabo-Islamic world, people were against globalization because it is cultural invasion, the West is invading us, and so on. That was the discourse, the dominant discourse. And in Europe, we used to hear another discourse. I was a student at Paris Sorbonne. We used to speak about multiculturalism, reciting certain verses from Walt Whitman. Why do I contradict myself? Because I am wide, because I am large, I contain multitudes. So we used to preach multiculturalism and to preach our values outside our borders. But now there is another dynamic in Europe. Europe is defining itself in terms of geography. To protect our values, we have to define ourselves by geography. Paradoxically, if you go to Syria, for instance, where people have lost everything, or to Libya, or to Yemen, or in the Arab world, there is a new dynamic installing itself. People are speaking in terms of common values and common action. So, you see, Europeans have to grasp the nature of the moment, not to understand things in terms of clash of civilization. We have to think globally, to think the world. And it is our duty, our responsibility, because terrorism, ISIS, I cannot identify with ISIS. What is this? As a Muslim, I know that at stake, it is not only religion understanding of the text or whatever. There are things that are beyond my grasping as a Muslim. But I say we have to work together in order to guarantee, to reach one thing, a space of wisdom which goes beyond certain belongings to religion, certain forms of belonging to religion, and at the same time, I forgot. Thank you very much. Yes. Yes. Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me now? Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I'm grateful to our panel and for all their comments. At this point, we'd like to open the floor for question and answer. When you have a question, if you would not mind waiting until the microphone is brought to you, we want the interpreters to be able to hear it too. And for those on the panel, if you press the push button. Yes, down here in front, Judge Wallace and just a little bit, please. Yes.
I want to thank the presenters. This has been very, very illuminating for me, not only my role in religion, but my role in law. And I'm sure the world is changing. I'm old enough to remember that. And we've heard a lot about how religion is moving in a changing world. But I failed to see where we embrace the security part. When I was a boy, there were very few automobiles coming in collision. Now we have so many cars out there, we have collisions all the time. And some parts of some religions become more aggressive, and we have problems. Now, then the political side says we have to keep our people secure. And that, to me, is the main issue we have in this changing world is we know things are changing, but the things that are changing is we know more about other people, they know more about us, and we interact more. And through that interaction, there becomes, at times, a 9/11 or something else where people say, wait a minute, we have to be secure. And then they don't say these are criminals, they say they're Muslims or they're somebody else. And then we get to the process of having this challenge. That, to me, is the most important key of the problem I see we're dealing with. And I would like to know your views of how that security fishing aspect of our topic should it come out.
Why don't we take a few questions and then give the whole panel time to range around both of them, if that's all right.
Mohammed Amin from the United Kingdom. My question is for Merete Bilde. How do the states of the European Union reconcile what they are saying to the rest of the world about freedom of religion and belief with the fact that many countries in the European Union have banned Jews and Muslims practicing kosher and halal slaughter?
And then one more question right behind you. And then we have well, let's go through and then we'll have to give our panel a chance to be able to respond before all the questions leave their heads.
Merci.
Yes, please.
Oh.
En français?
Je peux?
Okay, 1 minute. If you don't speak French, I encourage you to put on your headsets and turn to channel 22. So,
Ok.
speak.
Merci.
Thank you. I would like to
Dis merci
say thank you
tous les
to all of
intervenants
the speakers
pour les exposés
for the
denses
exposing
et très
the talks that they've spoken and that have been very interesting that we've listened to.
Ensuite,
Permettez, if you speak English, I'm sorry, I sent you a wild goose chase. It should be channel 1. Pardon.
ok.
Je vais traduire.
Voilà, donc sur l'intervention, la première intervention,
Talk.
Madame Azza Karam
Madame Mrs. Azza
s'occupe des questions de genre également au niveau des Nations Unies.
United Nations as well.
Et je souhaite
And I
savoir,
would like to know.
ça va?
Ça va.
Je souhaite savoir si
I would like to
les
know
femmes
if the women
qui sont souvent victimes
that are victims often
dans ces
in
attaques, dans
these
ces
attacks, in these conflicts,
victimes, j'allais dire, de tout ce qui se passe comme
that's
violence,
going on,
est-ce que ces femmes-là
are
aussi
these women
revendiquent
also,
une place
looking
dans
for a place themselves in
l'influence
the influence,
négative
the negative
des religions
of the
sur la paix et la
influence of
sécurité?
the religion negatively in the security.
Ensuite,
Also,
s'agissant du second intervenant,
talking about the second person who spoke, I heard from Mr. Andrew,
j'ai entendu sortir
I heard religion come out of politics,
et je me demande si
and I wonder if it's possible to take religion out of politics in the measure that religion is separated from society and politics is also part of taking care of society. I continue by saying to Madame Bett
qui a dit dans son intervention,
that said in her intervention
nous devons voir
that we must, Madame Bilde, we must have our own perception of the world.
je dis que c'est une réalité.
It's a reality. I sustain this idea because our belief on the others and their beliefs, it's what destroys the harmony of the world. Because it has been said that we mustn't judge the others if we don't want to be judged ourselves. And then finally, talking about the intervention of Mr. Khalid, he asked to avoid, to make sure that the children, the youth, believe that their religion is a burden. And that's a reality. The youth do need to be in harmony with the spirit of the time, as he so underlined it. But I would like to add, these youth are oftentimes taken out of their roots. They don't have any direction anymore, any directions. What do we need to do as adults? I don't know what we need to do, but we need to have a school for parents, to have a better, have them be surrounded, because these youth will be in the streets otherwise, and children in the streets will cause all these things that we can imagine against the religions. These are my observations. Thank you.
And then one last question, and then we'll turn to our
First of all, can I thank all of the presenters? It was excellent. And my question is directed to Merete, if I may. First of all, the work that EAS does is excellent, and I commend you on it. It really is very good work. My question goes to something that you said about practicing what we preach. And I think you can see where this is going, that the EU and certainly the European Commission tends in its departments to work in silos. And so while the EAS works wonderfully in its promotion of freedoms, and particularly freedom of religion or belief throughout the world, there is that creeping laïcité that informs a number of other sections of the Commission that work in silos and quite separately. And I want to suggest this, that there is a tension in the work that is done within some of those silos, enforcing laïcité, as correctly understood in the French concept, in areas within the EU, so that subsidiarity under Lisbon Treaty Article 5.3 is just overridden or ignored. And I don't want to suggest hypocrisy, but it certainly is a tension between the excellent work that you're doing and the somewhat impoverished work that's being done sometimes within the EU in that conflict of rights that's so created.
Thank you. Maybe we'll just start with Azza and just go down and let each of you respond to the questions that were directed to issues you spoke on.
Thank you very much indeed for the questions. I think one of the trends we're seeing now is that if the approach towards the realm of religious engagement is rooted in the security concerns, the security concerns tend to belong to certain countries. They are not 193 governments don't have security concerns about religion. A few of them do. So if we prioritize the concerns about security, we end up prioritizing the agenda of certain governments about certain religions. But the question is not, do we or do we not engage with the security agenda? Because we don't even have a choice. That's how we started the conversation about religion in the first place. It was from that concern about security, at least in the international organizations. I think the question is, how do we place the security concern vis-a-vis the human rights spectrum and the sustainable development goals that 193 governments agreed to sign on to, which include the security and the human development and the human rights. So it isn't so much, shall we ignore the security concerns, but how do we place them in perspective so that they are concerns that people, governments around the world can come to an agreement on, can see eye to, and if we place it within that broader spectrum, we reduce the risk of then highlighting specific religious groups and specific religions as the end-all and cause of every single trauma that seems to be the trauma of humankind. Is it too quick? Okay, so I guess the best answer to that question is precisely what we are trying to do within the United Nations system, which is we don't work as only development practitioners or only foreign policy, political affairs people, or even only counterterrorism colleagues or only human rights colleagues. We're working on the issue of religious engagements and feeding into it from a variety of sectors, which includes today the framework that we have, all of us as 193 countries, which is the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. Those 17 goals cover everything under the sun, and in fact cover the sun and the moon and everything between the universe. So in a way, if we have that as the framework of engagement, then we can begin to look at issues of religious liberty, and we begin to look at issues of security, and we begin to look at issues of human rights. It's a slightly more balanced perspective. It does not prioritize one particular set of concerns over another, but places them in a broader context. I'd like to be able to answer, and thank you very much for bringing up the question about women. One of the criticisms against this unconditional embrace of religious leadership that we are guilty of in the international system is that we end up with a room full of men, because religious leaders in most religious traditions tend to be men. And we find ourselves scrambling to find the voices of the women of faith who lead in their own right as social actors, as service providers. In a previous life, in my previous life, many lifetimes ago, I worked in a multi-religious context on development. 90% of the service providers, the ones running the schools and the clinics and the nutrition services and the sanitation, 90% of those actually doing the work are women. 90% of those speaking about the work are men. And so it's important to have both those perspectives at the table. And that is why when we are advocating that we engage with religious actors, we are doing so with a deliberate intention. We have guidelines for engaging with religious actors. The UN system actually has guidelines for engaging with religious actors. One of those guidelines is that we deliberately ensure that those that we reach out to and engage with and convene in the policy table have to be as religiously balanced, regionally balanced, and gender balanced as possible. We have redefined, and I think we heard this yesterday from the professor, we need to redefine and restructure the public space. If we restructure the public space, we have to also redefine our categories. And one of those categories is leadership, and religious leadership in particular. And if we redefine it, if we expand it, then we find ourselves, per definition, because of reality, including the women of faith, together with the men of faith at the same table. Just a last point on the silos, they're not just a European Union challenge. Silos are a challenge of all our work in the international system. And the truth of the matter is that creating this interagency mechanism was precisely a way of trying to overcome some of the silos, because then we have all the different sectors represented around the table. But it's hard to get every sector to take the other seriously. But I think there's more potential in the European Union context, and I'll leave that to Merete to answer. Thank you.
So I'll speak just very briefly to Judge Wallace, your question about security. Et c'est une réponse à vous, Madame, aussi, concernant votre question. So I think when we're looking at security, one of the challenges is that, based on what I was saying, is that as foreign policy actors, as diplomats, when we want to engage the security issue, if it's related to a particular religious conflict or a type of religious extremism, it really behooves us to understand something about how that religion is informing or malinforming what's going on. But it's not simply about conflict as it erupts, let's say, in the Middle East, around what's happening and been happening in Iraq and Syria. But let's take, for example, the case of Myanmar right now. Here you have a situation where you have an opportunity for a country to emerge into a greater, deeper pluralism, hopefully with some increased human rights, increased democratic openness. There were situations within that country, within Myanmar, that have been around for many, many decades, where there's been an inability for different groups to engage one another. And there's been an unwillingness to recognize the valid contribution of Rakhine Muslims, for example, Kachin, Chin Christians, to the Burmese project, let's call it that, the Myanmar state, the project of a shared citizenship. So now we have a security issue in Rakhine state that has erupted largely as a result of an inability for that country to come together and to engage the minorities that exist there, and the inability over the last year for Aung San Suu Kyi and those with her to challenge some of the military, challenge some of the pre-existing understandings of some members in the Bamar Buddhist community around who are these people. We have to live with them. We have to have an understanding of citizenship in this country that recognizes that they are citizens in this country. And because that wasn't happening, because there's a failure to understand that, and a failure on the part of Western diplomats to be able to engage effectively members of the Buddhist Sangha in Myanmar, to engage other religious leaders in Myanmar, because we didn't understand what was going on. Now we have a security issue where we're, again, somewhat unable to understand what are the underlying causes behind it. So what I'm advocating for is that as diplomats and as foreign policy actors, we have a greater awareness of what are the root causes of these security challenges. And I do think that you do have to have a little bit of theology. We can't just approach it purely from a sociological perspective. Theology helps you understand why people believe what they believe, and how those theological beliefs, not simply a culture, but theological beliefs lead people to act in a certain way. And I think just on the last point, religious leaders must include lay leaders. It's fine to go and speak to bishops and imams and chief rabbis and so forth, but you need to engage lay leadership in particular, because they're often the ones that are closest to the ground and know what's happening in any given situation. And so that'd be my plea for that. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be brief, but there were, I think, 3 questions. Just on the latter point of Myanmar, I think one thing is understanding. The other thing is having the political will to want to push something where you want to factor in the possible consequences of this. That doesn't omit us from knowing the right proportion of which part of this is a security problem, which part is a religious problem. But let us just say it's a huge, huge problem. And I wonder if these people were Christians, whether the reaction would have been the same. I will start by answering the question on practice what we preach, the whole issue of cohesion, and are we actually linking up? It's a huge challenge, and it is all the more huge that EU member states are very internally divided and sensitive on many of these points. And that's why I think we need to be very careful not to jeopardize the principle of subsidiarity, which is that anything that can find its, well, I shouldn't say that to you, you're experts in law anyway, but there is a growing element of pragmatism, which also the global strategy brings out, saying we really need to link up the puzzle pieces here and look at what is it we are doing inside the EU with the Fundamental Rights Agency, some of the initiatives of, at least on paper, trying to push towards a more coordinated, less segmented approach to xenophobia, racism, both in terms of color, religions, gender, et cetera, and the external projection of it. And that's where I find that small initiatives like what we have set out transatlantically has helped us work with the US and Canada to bring this forward and bring into the agenda also the more positive formulation, the right, the power of diversity, the choice of inclusion, to look at how can we get that together, because we do have good messages. Europe is getting a hard press these days, and not without reason, but we need also to remember that there are reasons why Europe remains a pole of attraction for a lot of people. And that ties into the problem of what was mentioned in terms of being self-analytical. We need to be self-analytical, yet there are members among us coming from some of these countries who say, don't you be apologetic, stand up, there's a reason why we went here, don't start to, out of political correctness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think we're guilty of that, but I think it's voices that we need to hear. We are working increasingly on issues where you would say, should we really be on that terrain, on the place of religion in society? Because we realize that without understanding our own way of looking at ourselves, engaging with others, we need to have that kind of baseline to understand what it is we want to achieve with others. And there we have some initiatives I would be happy to fill you in, but where really we understand, we try to make it a two-way street, not sort of EU giving a crash course on secularism and, once you hit modernity, it's all be over, but something else. Brings me to the excellent question by the UK colleague. Yes. Yes. As you know, there's a clash of rights here. The animal rights versus religious freedom. There's an overarching law or ruling by the EU that says stunning, and then leaves a certain discretion to member states. If the problem was purely technical, I think it would have found its solution. But because it's deeply political and it plays into the political debate, it is very, very intrinsically difficult. Even in Belgium, we have these problems, and where companies now try not to advertise too much that their products are halal because they don't want to be seen as caving in, should I say. And that's clearly a problem if that's the way we go about things. Again, I'd be happy to continue the conversation. My final point on securitization. It's funny, we only talk about security when it comes to Islam. We have a tendency to, by reacting the way we do, to sort of issue a blanket criminalization of Muslim communities. And I think we haven't learned a lot. One of the things we've done within the External Action Services, when we have particularly bright people coming in to animate our discussions, we put them aside, do what we call an EAS TED Talk, register it, and then we beam it out to our delegations so those who can't travel can at least hear and learn. And we did one with John Esposito, Professor John Esposito, on Is Islam to Blame? Lessons learned from 9/11. And I think really we should be having a sharper learning curve, but we are not. I mentioned what happens when Buddhism and Hinduism radicalizes, why we're not equally concerned about that. But also we need to ask ourselves, to what extent is the problem religious? Example, Iraq. So, contrary to what Andrew thinks, we actually do engage with religious actors, and we know the problem is not religious. But we also know that the solution is not religious. We know that we need to engage religious leaders, but really broadband, to get any kind of glue around a reconciliation to stick. And that's where we have great convening power. We can get people together. We are seen as less intrusive maybe than our US colleagues, and we are trying to build on that, but without securitizing the role of religions, without seeing that's where the problem stems from. And then finally, I know it's a point that we are not allowed to talk much about, but I think it's important to say, when we want to fight counterterrorism and radicalization, our partners in crime are sometimes the ones that fuel radicalization. And it's a vicious circle. Thank you.
À propos de votre question excuse me. I would say that there are radicals with no roots. We speak about radicals, but those radicals, it seems to me, have no root. In the age of digital culture, we are witnessing some new phenomena. People are no longer, they are no longer listening to a preacher. They become themselves preachers. I receive from people who have no knowledge whatsoever, of a religion, they would send you 100 WhatsApps a day to convey a message. I'll give you one example. For instance, last week there was elections in Germany, and young people were exchanging WhatsApps messages to say that voting is illicit, is not Islamic, and so on. So they have become preachers themselves. They just cherry pick, do a work of selection get some religious message out of context, not because they are rooted in the context or rooted in religious knowledge. No, they have become preachers themselves, but without assuming any moral responsibility or whatsoever. This is a new phenomenon. That is a new challenge. Thank you.
Thank you all. In view of the time, we will just say thank you to our panel one more time, and then we will break and start again at 11 promptly. I apologize for the delayed schedule, but we hope at this point to keep us on. Lunch is at noon for our delegates, and those who've registered in advance will be across the street. In the meantime, just a reminder that translation will go on. There'll be Spanish translation in this session here, Spanish and Portuguese also next door in 306. 314 behind me will have Ukrainian, Russian, and Italian. And downstairs in 205 will be Arabic. Downstairs in 206 will be Mongolian, Laotian, Korean, and Vietnamese. So thank you again to our panel for their insights.